I am Victoria, and I am part of the CBA education team with Mark Asprey, Dan Perkins, and Steve Taylor. We had the pleasure of doing this particular workshop live in February, and we had plans to do more. So since that got taken away from all of us, I'm very happy to be able to do this via this format today. And kind of, as Miguel said, usher in a new way of sharing blacksmithing skills. So the topic for today is the basket handle and the fire poker, but it's really kind of a sneaky way of providing you with an exercise in forge welding. And if you have been blacksmithing for any amount of time, you already have the skills needed to weld. We just need to talk about how to put those together. And there's no secret to forge welding. It's just a matter of doing it. You need to practice. And that's what's so great about the basket handle is that it's essentially a myriad of welds, and you end up with a great little project at the end of it. The welds in this, before I get too far down the road, the handout for this is in the online magazine. It's in the July-August edition. So let's get back to the welds in this basket handle. There are 3 different types. The first weld you'll perform is a faggot weld, and it's can be found here at this little end where all these pieces come together. And the other side is here underneath this collar weld, which is this little bit of business here. And then you attach this basket handle that you assemble to a long rod, and that's where your drop tong weld is. So right here in this tiny little package are 3 different types of welds and 4 chances to weld. So the first order of business is to get the middle prepared. And to do that, we're going to start with 2 round bars, 1/4 inch in diameter and about 12 inches long. That'll get you to just under probably about 5-inch baskets. And if you want them longer, you can make this rod longer. Like anything with blacksmithing, everything's modifiable to what you want to do. So we're going to start with lining the 2 pieces up side by each with the ends lined up, and we're going to find the center. This neat little trick will help you find the center without having to get out your ruler. So make a mark right down the middle, or as close to the middle as you think you can get, and then hold on to one and flip the other one around. Then you'll end up with something that looks like this, and it's very simple from here to find the true center line. Make another mark across both bars, and we're using soapstone here. At this point, I take away these initial marks because by the time I get to this step, I can't remember which mark's which. Using the mark you made with the soapstone, you're going to just take that bar over a sharp corner of your anvil and give it a sharp rap with your hammer and make a mark that won't disappear in the fire. And it's very important that you be able to see this mark once it's hot. So with the metal hot, right in the middle, we're going to bend this, and we're simply going to bend it in half. You want this little mark that we made on the side of the anvil to be on either the left or right side. It doesn't matter which, you just don't want it on the top or the bottom. If it's on the top or the bottom, as you start to bend, that mark will go away. But if you leave it on the side, you'll be able to see it as you bend this around. And the reason why that's important is these legs are going to like wibble wobble around a little bit. So it's going to be hard to just match up the ends. It's a better tactic, an easier tactic to just keep your eye on the center. Once you have that bent all around, you can see the mark is right on the center and it's still very visible. Straighten the legs out, make sure everything's nice and straight. You do want the open ends. You do want the open ends slightly open, about 1/4 of an inch. So if you've closed it all up, that's fine. Just put it flat, one smart wrap right here, and you'll end up with something like this. Once you have 2 of those, you can insert them from the open ends like so. And these ends are gonna wiggle about. So you want it to rest firmly on the rounded edge or the closed end until you get something like this. At this point, you want to switch to 1/4 inch V-bit tongs, or excuse me, 1/2 inch V-bit tongs. You will have started with 1/4 inch tongs because you started with 1/4 inch material. Now, when you put those together, you have a 1/2 inch. So size up your tongs and then make sure that you're always holding on to the open ends. If you hold that by these closed ends, these open ends are gonna splay out as you do anything. So let's watch a video getting to this point. So with the mark right on the center of that anvil, you start bending that around and keep an eye on that mark. Make sure that as you bend this or fold this, that mark, it stays in the right spot. Straighten the bar out, nice and tidy, which is true anytime you're forging. You want to keep everything as straight as possible. Insert the one into the other via the open ends. And you can see how the open ends splay out. If you leave those splayed out when you go to forge weld this, they're going to just burn up in the fire. So it's very important that you're holding on to the open ends and that the open ends are touching the round end so that the tiniest part doesn't get burnt in the fire. We're now ready to do our faggot weld. We've got everything nicely bundled up. But before we get into the welding, let's talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the metal acts when you hit it with a hammer or the impact of the hammer penetration into the metal. And there's 4 factors that influence this, and it's something that you should be aware of regardless of what we're doing. But for forge welding, it becomes even more important. The first factor is the type of metal that you're using. In this case, we're using mild steel. And the important part about mild steel, or the important thing to know about mild steel, is that it's a little bit squishier than tool steel that might have a higher carbon content and is going to act a particular way since it has that lower carbon content. The second factor is how hot you get this metal. And for forge welding, while there is a range of hot that you can use, the yellow hot, without burning the metal, without getting it white hot, is what we want to do to ensure a good weld. To get metal yellow hot, your fire has to be yellow hot. So if you're getting ready to put this piece of metal in the fire to forge weld and you don't see any yellow coals, the the metal won't get that hot either. So first order of business is to make sure that your forge is the right temperature, that the fuel in your forge is the right temperature. If you're using propane, you'll want to make sure that that is heated to the appropriate temperature, and sometimes that can take a little extra time. The other thing to think about is when you get metal this hot, well, any heat really, you're going to get scale. And the closer your piece is to the airflow, the more oxidation you will get. The oxidation, or what I like to call high-speed rust, will create a dirty spot on your metal, which is not weldable. So the minute your piece starts to look dry and crusty, it's not hot enough and there's too much scale on it. So let's look at what that looks like. So here we have a nice yellow hot fire, and this is a video, so you'll see the flames moving about, and there's a piece of metal in there, but we can't see it because it's the same temperature as the coals. And this is what I mean by wet. You see the crust down here? See the wet up here? This is how wet and shiny your metal should look when you're ready to forge weld it. The time it's sitting here, even though it's still over a fire, it's getting colder. And as it gets colder, it gets this dry crust on it. And that's that oxidation, which makes the metal dirty and it won't weld. The side that's been down in the fire is still nice wet, so we get to see how that looks one more time, but it quickly gets too cold and too dirty to weld. So the third factor in hammer penetration is the strength of the blow. And for some reason, when people are forge welding, they think they have to hit it really hard. And the truth of the matter is, you do not. The only thing a big, heavy blow is going to do to your metal is forge it. It's going to deform that piece, and it will not weld that piece. The harder the blow, the more likely you're just gonna kind of muck up an end that you just carefully prepared to weld. So light to moderate blows. And the only thing I can say is that the weld is happening at an atomic level, and you just need to beat the time. You just need to make sure that you are tapping them and encouraging that atomic level weld to take place while the metal is still the right temperature. And hitting it too hard will totally obliterate that little introduction. And then the final factor is the location of the blow. And this may seem like common sense, but it's important that we think about it because we want to make sure that we are perpendicular. So if this is our welding plane, these are our 1/4 inch round rods lined up, ready to go. And the weld we want to elicit is right here in this little line. So the hammer blows come from, you know, this side or this side, essentially perpendicular to the welding plane, which is what we're going to call this line where we want the weld to take place. And then from here, our goal is to get everything aligned, which in this case, with the faggot weld, everything's all lined up and ready to go. We just need that out of the fire onto the anvil at the right temperature and tap it before the heat is lost. And one way to help you in this race against time is to use flux. Do you absolutely have to use flux to weld? No, you do not. The right temperature on very clean metal will allow you to weld without flux. But what flux does is it buys you a little time. It's slightly corrosive. It's going to eat up some of that scale, as well as put a glassy surface on there, which buys you a little more time. However, it's important to note that the biggest thing I think flux does is it boosts your confidence. It makes you feel more confident that this piece is going to weld together because you fluxed it. And if I have a low confidence day, I use one kind of flux, and if I'm feeling really good about it, I use a different kind, and just the rather regular anhydrous borax. So I can attest to the fact that it gives you confidence. So when I'm at this stage, and we've heated the piece up, we've brushed it, we've fluxed it, and we've reheated it, it's now time to position it and hit it while it's still yellow hot. And if you need to move quickly and confidently, but don't be in a rush and don't be out of breath. If you move too fast, that can cause other problems. You might drop the piece, you might trip over something. So I like to count to 3. At the fire, I notice that my piece is the right temperature, and I lift it up out of the fire. I count to 1, either out loud or in my head. Now I'm going to turn, I'm going to set the piece on the anvil. That's 2. And then by 3, I have the hammer in my hand and I'm tapping the piece that I want to weld. And in this case, we have our little bundle here. You're going to just tap it right on top. We want to go about 1.25 inches back, turn it over and tap the other side. Maybe 1, 2, turn it, 1, 2 on the other side. If you still have a welding heat, you can move on to the next step, which would be to square this up. If you'll notice, it's a bit of a diamond shape, and you want to take it to square as soon as possible. But if you go too soon, before the weld is set, or you wait till it got too cold, the weld it's pretty fragile at this point, it could fall apart. So you really want to make sure that tap one side, turn it over, tap on the other side. And at that point, I usually brush it, reflux it, and go through this whole process again. I don't ever want this while I'm welding. I don't ever want my piece to get any less than bright orange. So let's watch forge welding of this end on my little video. This is a 1/2 inch bottom swedge. It's not 100% necessary. It just helps keep everything together while you're welding, but you can do this right on the anvil too. So we start on the open end, couple taps on the top, turn it all the way over, still got a nice yellow heat. So notice that going right to square and starting to square that out. None of these blows are actually forging the piece. It's important that we keep as much material there as possible, and there's no need to blend these in. And that might take you 3 times. Just be very careful that you're not over forging the piece at this point. Now we're ready to talk about getting this ready for our second weld.